Just very briefly, the study we've done on rapid growth markets, 25 rapid growth markets that we've selected based on a few key criteria, which we can discuss in more detail. I guess looking to extend the focus with a shifting global economy, with shifting capital flows away from the more advanced economies towards what many people would term emerging economies. From our perspective, I guess the term emerging in some ways is a little bit, firstly patronizing, given that many of the economies that we're focusing on are fairly advanced in and of their own right. The second point also is that emerging economies tend to focus in on the four big BRIC economies, rather than we've looked to extend that or expand that net, particularly given the changing dynamics in the global economy. And I guess we're particularly excited this year, in this first of these 25 these rapid growth market assessments, that there are 5 African economies included. Besides South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, and Egypt have been included as among the 25 rapid growth markets. So I think for us, it's both an acknowledgement of the increasingly important role that Africa is playing in a global context, and the increasing attractiveness to international investors of African markets. But also important to us in the sense, we've been advocating for a little while now that we shouldn't be simply benchmarking African markets against one another, that we need to be benchmarking African markets against other emerging markets, against other rapid growth markets, and seeking to, in a way, go to head against those other rapid growth markets in the competition to attract international capital. So, from a purely African perspective, I think that's why this study is particularly relevant to us. The study this is the inaugural one, but it will be a quarterly event or quarterly study that's brought out. And part of our contribution, I guess, to the growing body of work, body of analysis out there on emerging markets and rapid growth markets. So perhaps we can just open to questions now. The question is, what are the most rapid growing industries? So I guess if you can bear with me, and maybe whoever's put their question up could perhaps elaborate if they want to. But if I had to focus on it from an African perspective, as opposed to across the rapid growth markets, because you'd appreciate that, these are an incredibly diverse group of economies. But if I had to look at it from an African perspective, I guess there's no secret that commodity prices are a key driver of some African economies. So, oil and gas and natural resources, mining, agriculture increasingly are a lot of growth coming from those. But from an African perspective, I think what's very important in terms of the sustainability of the growth in Africa, and if you've had a look at the IMF's latest sub-Saharan regional outlook, a lot of the growth that's coming out of Africa is demand-driven. In other words, it's being driven by African consumers. And that is a critical point, I think, in terms of the long-term sustainability of our growth on this continent. In some ways mirroring, obviously, in and of themselves, smaller than the likes of India and China, but the what's the right word? The robustness, I guess, of those economies, and that we're not completely tied into the prices of commodities. So we see sectors like consumer products, like telecommunications, like financial services growing tremendously well in many parts of the continent. So that's the African view on sectors and industries. Which are the 5 countries? So I'm assuming which are maybe the 5 most exciting countries, the 5 most rapidly growing economies. Obviously, depending on which lens you're using on this. So again, if I look across the rapid growth market, so across the 25, Ghana this year is the fastest growing economy in the world. And I think that the oil production coming online on the back of what is a reasonably diverse and diversifying economy makes it one of the very exciting economies among the 25. One cannot ignore China and India in any kind of list. So they are certainly among the shining stars, I guess. Beyond that, there's a group of countries that are looking quite interesting, including Colombia looks quite interesting, Kazakhstan looks quite interesting. countries that are being, buoyed at the moment, I guess, by high commodity prices. The challenge, of course, beyond that, if we're looking at a longer term perspective, is if there is some softening in those commodity prices, which are of those rapid growth markets, which are the ones that are, I guess, best geared to grow into the future? A robust consumer-driven and growing consumer-driven domestic market. So at the top of that list again would be China and India, but certainly countries and I think Africa does well there. I think certainly economies like Nigeria increasingly, although it's still very dependent on oil. But certainly Ghana are very exciting. I think once Egypt gets beyond its current political problems, within the next couple of years, we'll start to see growth picking up there, and a very strong domestic-driven economy there too. So perhaps if I could see another question. What are the main factors that lead to rapid growth, and what is the situation in Africa? Yeah, that's a good question. I think again, we're talking about a diverse group of economies here. So let me just pick out a few factors that are pretty important. There's no doubt that having certainly for many African economies, a commodity that is in high demand, or commodities that are in high demand, be they oil, be they gold, be they aluminium, be they whatever. We know that Africa is resource rich, and that includes obviously our agricultural output, which is fairly large, but certainly could be a lot larger. So the commodity prices, food is probably going to be a key driver of growth going forward over the long term. So just having something to sell, I guess, is critically important. I think certainly what many African economies have got right over the last decade is strong economic policy and dealing with debt, getting inflation under control, and ensuring that many of those economies are in a state to weather. Certainly they weathered the first financial crisis pretty well, the global financial crisis. But I think that many African economies remain in a good state to weather that financial crisis. So, solid, stable economic platforms, and I think there's no doubt as well, again, certainly in the African context, that business-friendly reform has been a key driver of growth and development. And that's probably true across the rapid growth market. So the more successful, sustainable rapid growth markets are the ones that have consistent, stable economic policies, that are reforming, becoming more business friendly. And I guess over time, although people might argue that China is the exception to the norm, but certainly in the African context, the democratization process has also been a key driver of economic growth and development over the last decade. I hope that answers that question. Please elaborate if you want me to say more. What is the effect of rapid growth markets on the global economy? I guess it depends on which perspective one looks at this from. The global economy, there's no secret that the global economy is struggling at the moment. Particularly if we look at the global economy through the lens of the advanced economies, be that North America, Europe in particular, and Japan, which has been struggling for a while. I guess what the rapid growth, on one hand, they may be perceived as a threat by some, but I think they shouldn't be. I think they should be perceived as an opportunity, and particularly for companies, organizations, investors looking to grow. The rapid growth markets offer a tremendous opportunity. I mean, that is where the growth in the global economy is happening now. But equally important, that is where a lot of investment is coming from, and increasing flows of investment and capital are coming from those rapid growth markets. So the rapid growth markets themselves, in this, what may seem to some as a strange turnaround, in a sense, could be also drive growth into the advanced economies over the next few years. But certainly the rapid growth markets are going to be a critical driver of growth and recovery in the global economy. There's no doubt about that. can just read the question. Ian Y's report states some countries have been particularly successful in attracting FDI inflows. Which countries are these? So, yeah, I mean, there's actually an interesting study that we're doing on the side of this, which is part of our Africa attractiveness research. We brought a report out a couple of months ago, focusing specifically on FDI flows into the African continent, and trying to analyze some of the trends and what they meant. And there's no doubt for us that, in general, Africa punches beneath its weight in terms of certainly in terms of the African growth story that we've seen over the last decade or so, and what we believe is an increasingly compelling investment proposition. And what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe just hold on that question and that analysis for a couple of months, because we feel that there are lessons to be learned from certain other economies in terms of how they've positioned themselves, how they've sold themselves in order to attract international capital in a way that African economies can learn from. But I'd really like us to position that in a more articulate, coherent way when we've got the data to support it. At the moment, it's just speculative. But thank you for joining us in the afternoon, your time. I guess what we are looking forward to is forthcoming analysis from this group of 25. As I said up front, I think it's particularly important for African countries, and we've highlighted 4 African countries in this report. But certainly, from my perspective, I believe that there's another group of African countries that is kind of in a sense bubbling under, sort of just off the radar screen, and it's a diverse group, and it would include the likes of we can start from Ethiopia down to the East African countries. Clearly, there's a whole group of East African countries: Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, down to Mozambique, Zambia, that are all growing at 7% plus over a sustained period of time. And for us, I mean, incredibly exciting growth across a broad range of countries. I mean, those are just the ones that I've chosen to highlight here. So starting to place those countries in a global perspective, I think will become increasingly useful for us as Africans. Certainly for those Africans who are looking to position Africa in a global context, in a context where there's increasingly strong competition for capital, for investment flows, and so on. So even if it's only from that perspective, I think this report on an ongoing basis will be particularly useful for us. But more broadly, as I said earlier, there's no doubt that these are the economies that are going to be driving the future of the global economy, certainly over the not only in the short term, but in the medium to long term. So I urge you to just sort of stay in touch. We'll be sending this material out on a quarterly basis, and if anybody wants to get in touch directly with me, ask some more questions or anything, by all means. There is one more question that's popped up here. So it's just popped off, Nicholas. From the Africa report, sorry. My question is, how is investment in Africa likely to be hit by the growing eurozone debt crisis? And that's obviously that's a very good question. And it's a difficult one to answer. I guess it depends on what one's outlook is for the eurozone. Firstly, I guess in terms of our baseline forecast in this report, there are going to be certain African markets that are harder hit than others. Certainly, those that are more closely integrated into the European economy in terms of trade and investment. There's no doubt that an economy like South Africa, which is very tightly integrated into the global economy, has already felt the impact of the eurozone crisis and the more general global crisis. And South Africa's, we forecasting, or Oxford Economics, who did the forecast for us, is forecasting sort of just under 3% growth for South Africa this year and next year, largely as a result of the impact of the debt crisis. But there are a number of other economies, as long as oil prices and commodity prices stay fairly firm, and with the increasingly buoyant domestic economies, Uh, you know, certainly the African economies or many of the African economies, certainly the sub-Saharan economies, are set to maintain relatively robust growth. I mean, they'll certainly track these rapid growth markets, the large majority of them. I think that the concern in terms of investment, a large proportion of investment into Africa still comes from Europe. So there's no doubt that there'll be a knock-on effect in that regard, that investment will slow. But by the same token, there's no doubt that the largest growth over the last 5 years has been in investment and trade from the emerging economies or from the rapid growth markets, led by China, of course, but markets like India, Brazil, Korea, Turkey, South Africa itself playing an increasingly big role in investment into the continent. And in fact, I mean, a little known fact, in terms of our analysis that we did in Africa Attractiveness, the United Arab Emirates was the single biggest capital investor into the continent over an 8-year odd period. So a lot of investment from the Middle East that's waking up again and looking for a home. So I think investment will soften, certainly, no doubt from the developed world, but there will be, the investment from the emerging markets will continue to grow. So we're very bullish on the outlook for Africa, certainly in relative terms when we look across the world. Who are the main investors in Africa? So perhaps I can look. I need to interpret that question, I guess. I mean, if we're looking at countries, as I said, the developed markets remain key investors into Africa. So the United States, although its capital investment has declined somewhat over the last decade or so, the number of projects that American companies are investing into have remained constant. In other words, there's been when you dig beneath that, there's been a bit of a shift from the sort of mining resources, oil and gas, towards the tertiary sector. In other words, consumer-facing sectors. So American investment it remains big. European investment remains big. But as I said, Chinese, Indian is growing phenomenally well. 25% growth in Indian investment over the last 8 years. Korean investment is growing very strongly, about 70% growth over the last 8 years. Investment from Brazil is holding steady. Turkey and many of the Middle Eastern. So that's where the investment is coming from. In terms of which companies and which kinds of investors, I mean, it's a spread across the board. Resources remain a big player in Africa, obviously. Oil and gas, new oil and gas discoveries, or the production coming online in Ghana, new discoveries in East Africa is drawing a lot of new investments. The mining sector remains strong. A lot of investment coming into agriculture, especially from the emerging markets. But increasingly as well, as I mentioned earlier, what we call the consumer-facing sectors, like telecoms, like financial services, like retail and consumer products, like pharmaceuticals. Those are all big growth sectors. Tourism, business services, all big growth sectors. Another question, in light of what is happening in Kenya, Somalia, and Libya, how do you see future stability for Africa? So, what we say to our clients, and I'm in Korea for the rest of this week speaking to various clients of the firm, talking to them about investing and doing business in Africa. What people, and clearly, obviously not people on this call, but what people need to get their head around is that Africa is an incredibly diverse continent. 54 countries. There's always going to be hotspots, trouble spots. But increasingly, that is the exception rather than the rule. And I think we as Africans need to be increasingly telling that story. That the continent is not Somalia, it's not Libya, it's not the Ivory Coast, it's not Zimbabwe. That is part of the continent. It's part of the story of the continent, but it's only increasingly a small part of the story of the continent. What about the stories? The many other stories. What about the stories of peaceful and successful democratic elections over the last while? I mean, let's tell them the story of what's happened in Zambia with a peaceful transfer of power. Let's tell them the stories of Ghana. Let's tell them the stories of Botswana. Let's tell them the stories of South Africa. These are one of many. The presidential elections and the peaceful election, or relatively peaceful elections in Nigeria. I mean, these are the success stories. However much we may be skeptical about those, because we may say that it's a relative democracy. progress that we've seen in terms of democratization, in terms of political stability, in terms of the reduction of conflict across the continent over the last decade have been phenomenal. I mean, if you'd even dreamed that 10 years ago, I think people would have thought that you were smoking something. And yet, yeah, and so while we must still deal head on with the real challenges on the continent and the realities of the continent, we must also celebrate the achievements that we've made over a relatively short space of time. So in general, sorry, let me answer the question directly then. In general, I think there's going to be speed bumps along the way, and there are going to be hotspots, and certainly, countries like Libya and Somalia and Kenya to some extent. I think Kenya's got some sort of economic challenges that need to be dealt with, macroeconomic challenges. There are going to be speed bumps, but that the same can be said for any developing region in the world. There's a question. ENY recently established its Africa Business Center. Are you seeing significant interest from foreign companies to invest in Africa? And if so, which countries and industries? So I have covered some of this, but I think let me give you some. Rather than talk about stats, let me give you some anecdotal evidence, I guess. I'm in Korea this week. I was in Brazil 2 weeks ago. Some colleagues of mine over the last month to 6 weeks have been in India and in China. We travel, often to the States, to the UK. Colleagues, from the Africa Business Center. And what we do is we talk about Africa. We talk about the growth story of Africa. We talk about not simply the good news story of Africa, but that is something that we feel needs to be told. We also talk about the challenges of doing business across the continent. But the response from our clients and from potential investors and from investors into the continent is overwhelmingly positive. I mean, to the extent that we simply cannot keep up. So there's no doubt that we are seeing significant interest, both, I guess, spoken interest in spirit, but also, people putting money where their mouths are. I mean, from all corners of the world, people that are coming through our Africa Business Center, and that we are engaging with on their growth strategies, on their investment strategies, on setting up shop in different countries, on scaling up, on expanding. It's incredibly exciting for us because we're feeling it. It's not just something that we're reading about. And as I said, if I had to name countries, I mean, if I can pick a few, there's no doubt that Ghana is a country that elicits a lot of excitement. Nigeria, for all sorts of reasons, starting with its size and its oil. There's a bit more nervousness about North Africa at the moment, but East Africa as a region, I think, rather than necessarily as individual countries, I think people are seeing a lot of potential in East Africa, particularly investors from some of the rapid growth markets, India in particular. People seem very excited about East Africa as a region. Mozambique is sparking a lot of interest. I mean, for obvious reasons, Brazilian investors into Angola and Mozambique, but also extending beyond that. But we're seeing Chinese, we're seeing South Africans moving up. I mean, it's not just the sort of the handful of pioneers now. We're seeing South African companies a lot of whom moved offshore in the 90s, say, some of which moved into other parts of the continent, and others which moved into, let's call it, the more developed world, who are starting to see the challenges that they've faced in the developed economies versus the progress and the, to be honest, the profits that some of their peers are making from other African countries, and are starting to, most listed South African companies with some capital are developing or have developed or growth strategies. So we're seeing interest from all over the world, and again, in the sectors that I've named, and it's across the board: mining, oil and gas, agriculture, in terms of primary, and then the consumer-facing sectors like telecommunications, consumer products, pharmaceuticals, financial services is an increasingly big player, and that's just the start of the list. Nicholas, I think that's it.
Can you
Oh
read the
no,
last
sorry, another
question?
one. Sure, somebody's going to trip me up here. Officials at the EU summit over the weekend suggested establishing a special purpose vehicle with the IMF to attract funding from prominent emerging countries to deal with the region's debt crisis. What are your thoughts on that? That's a good one. I mean, my first thought is of in a sense of the irony of it, and one wonders what conditions should be attached to that kind of conditionality attached to that kind of, given the conditionality that the IMF and the EU tend to attach to its loans. Look, there's no doubt that the health of the global economy is, or the health of the EU, the health of the US economy, is tied into the health of the global economy. So, in the longer term, it's in the interests of the emerging countries, of the rapid growth countries, to support the eurozone, the US, when they're in a crisis. I mean, that's about as much as I can say about it. And we've got a last question. One last question. Here we go. For South African companies, how important is expanding in the African market to their future growth? If we start with the South African economy, and South Africa is one of the rapid growth markets that is listed there, and in some senses, I guess, if you simply look at growth, it's a little bit of an anomaly because, while South Africa is still growing, well compared to the advanced economies, it's certainly not keeping up with some of the other rapid growth markets. I think what ensures South Africa is on that list is its strategic positioning, and its strategic importance generally for business. Its relative size, it's one of the top 30 economies in the world. Its population size is one of the top 30 in the world. So it's critical mass as a market. As I said, it's growing at a relatively decent rate, and that growth will pick up over time, but not enough to drive the kind of growth that South African company, not the domestic market itself, is not going to drive it. So they have to look offshore. They are increasingly global companies themselves. And the developed markets are challenging for them. So where do they compete? Where can they compete? And that needs to be their starting point. Asia is an intensely competitive market. Latin America is a very difficult market to compete in, given the strength of Brazil in that market. So, Africa, given its growth, given its robust growth, given its sustainable growth story, and given its potential, is an obvious region for South African companies to grow into. I mean, there's no doubt that growth into the rest of Africa should be at the heart of most South African companies' growth strategies. I could go on for an hour, and I'd be happy to, but I think that's it. Nicholas, thanks very much to APO, and again, my apologies to everybody. We are hugely excited by this research, hugely excited from an African perspective. We are doing a lot of research ourselves into investment trends into Africa, and are doing a lot of selling of the African growth story. So I really do encourage anybody who wants to talk further about what we're doing, what our perspectives are, to get in touch with us. You're welcome to get in touch with me directly. Thank you very much to everybody. I really appreciate your time, and once again, apologies.